Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL week number 7 overview and analysis video in the spring split. It's our final full week of LPL action in the regular season here. At the end of this week, we are going to have a pretty good idea of where a lot of these teams are going to stand. The final playoff spots still might be up for debate, but most of what we are going to know about these, teams and where they're going to land and, who's going to be playing off in these play-in series, it will be determined across this week and whether or not teams can step up or step aside. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions on how these games go down there and where these teams are sitting at. Of course, as per usual, I will be going over everything here today, but still do want to do a little bit of promo at the beginning of this, as we've done the past couple of weeks, and that's because while my regular season casting might be over for LPL English, I will be casting one of the play-in series. It will be the night of the 27th, the morning of the 28th, whatever is easiest for you to remember. That's a Tuesday night or a Wednesday morning, technically, throughout it, so go ahead and stop by. We don't know what series that will be yet because the teams aren't locked in for play-ins, and, the order isn't locked in yet, but I will be doing one play-in series, so definitely stop by if you are interested in that. But kind of transitions me into talking about the fact that I did cover quite a few of the games this week live on broadcast, and so if you want my full opinions on those, we'll be pointing them out as we go throughout the video. They'll be indicated by an asterisk at the bottom of the screen. You can check out, the VODs to that link in the description. You can also check out the link in the description to, be there live when I end up commentating that play-in series. But without further ado, let's get into the actual content, shall we? If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 16, or I guess mostly number 1 to number 10. Group Nirvana is already done, and so those bottom tier teams are kind of locked in terms of where they're going to be in the power rankings, but these top tier teams still have a lot to play for, so I'm excited to go over that. But of course, most of today will be spent talking about the games themselves. So without further ado, after a 2-minute intro, let's go ahead and get into day number 1. I casted day 1 and day 7, our bookend days of week number 7, so I'll be a little bit quicker on the first couple series here, and we kick off day 1 with a pretty obvious matchup between ThunderTalk Gaming and Anyone's Legend. That AL really had no trouble being able to pick up a dominant victory, and this is them, getting back on track, or staying on track, quite frankly, in terms of where they've been across most of this year. I think they dropped a little bit in people's perception after last week because they just didn't look all that consistent over the course of last week. The loss to Bilibili in particular really kind of put a damper, I would say, on what people were expecting from Anyone's Legend, because I think we were looking at them as a clear top 1 or top 2 team in the LPL, especially after that win over Top Esports. Losing to BLG, even with their reemergence, has definitely not felt quite as good, but this is a nice bounce back series. ThunderTalk has kind of been the get right team in Group Ascend. When you go up against them, it's kind of just getting your mojo back, like you can't really do against a lot of the other teams. But like I said, for ThunderTalk, they're just not very good, and I think specifically their solo laners just can't hold a candle to basically anybody else at this level, specifically in Group Ascend. I think you can make an argument that both of them are bottom 3 or bottom 4 in their role in the LPL, like full stop, including Group Nirvana, and that's really not good for a team that's trying to duke it out with the best teams in the league pretty regularly. So again, pretty quick synopsis here. Couple of players on AL that really dominated. Tarzan is the obvious choice for player of the series. Not only was the Nefiri game incredibly dominant for him in game number 1, which it always is. Like, why do we keep giving Tarzan Nefiri? How is that even remotely an option at this point for so many different teams that continue to try and make this mistake? But the Pantheon was also incredible. In game number 2, we're seeing Pantheon plus, mobile, macro-oriented mid laner as a very common combo, whether that be the Rise, like it was here in game number 2, or Talia, or Galio, or, something of that regard. Some champion that's going to be able to move around the map and create in that way. Tarzan kind of as the main, focal point for AL and where they want to put a lot of their resources in the early game, almost always does such a phenomenal job at being able to push the tempo, and he did so again here. I do also want to give a big shout out to Hope, though, especially in game number 2 on the Ezreal, where he really popped off. I know LPL Ezreal is a little bit of a meme in the community, but Hope was incredibly good in this game, and I think in most series, once again, he would get player of the series, but his team is just too good around him. I feel like I've said that 85 times over the course of this year, where, Hope is the second option for player of the series, but can't quite walk away with it. Shanks was also dominant in the mid lane. I mean, this was a gigantic gap in the middle of the map here for AL. It just was not even remotely close for ThunderTalk to be able to try and uphold. Vondra was fine on the top side, even pulled out the Nasus in game number 2, and then, you know, of course, KL was really solid in the support position. He's one of the best supports in the world, but AL looking dominant, and ThunderTuck, they just don't have the firepower to keep up here. I've continuously pushed this narrative that ThunderTuck would probably, with Xiao Huangren, even struggle in Group Nirvana. This might not even be a top 12 team in the LPL right now once they lost Beishuan, because really they just do not have a power point on the map. You're hoping and praying that that can be 1xN and Feather, who are the best players on this team, but the problem is you're not just going up against any bot lane regularly, you're going up against a Group Ascend bot lanes very regularly, and in that context, 1xN and Feather are just kind of average. You know, I would consider them a top 7 or a top 8 bot lane in the LPL, which is pretty good, but, you know, there's a lot of better bot lanes in Group Ascend that they're facing regularly, including Hope and Kale, and so you're not exactly able to, you know, express that pressure nearly as much, and that, you know, kind of brings the point that the solo laners are just really, really awful. Hoya has been pretty unplayable ever since lane swaps were removed from the game, and Satab is really bad. Like, when he loses, he just looks incredibly terrible. He's gonna get dud of the series here. And it's pretty obvious where his mistakes end up coming in. He's just not a player that can even remotely play without resources. If he has to play from behind at all, he's going to get absolutely trounced. These are on champions that he's had a decent amount of success on, things like the Yone, things like the Aurora, and it doesn't matter. Like, it does not matter. If he's down gold, he's not going to be able to play the game. Xiao Huangren has been a pretty massive downgrade for Beishuan. I think we all kind of expected that, specifically those who had been watching this channel for a while, where I'd been talking about how, you know, Xiao Huangren's tape has not necessarily looked good. He's not really shown a lick of development in the last couple of years as he's been in the ThunderTalk system, but, you know, we know who this TT team is at this point, which is a team that doesn't really have top-end talent. They're hoping and praying that they can get either their jungle or their bot lane into a position where they can carry the game and get resources early. If they can't do that, they're just going to lose, and that's just who they are. And for AL on the other side, they're way too talented to be able to fall to that. It's nice to see them get back into the win column after what was a tumultuous week number 6, and we're hopeful that they're going to be able to keep it up. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it was a matchup between Ninjas in Pyjamas and FunPlus Phoenix, where NIP is going to take the 2-0 series win. They dominate this one, and it kind of continues to peddle the narrative that I've been pushing so far, that first of all, NIP has gotten significantly better over the past couple of weeks. I think they've just found a better playstyle. Of course, solo kill coming in has kind of been a big reason for that. I think stabilizing the top side of the map has opened up more things for everybody else on the team, but pretending like it's just solo kill coming in and, you know, automatically making this team better, I think is not correct. I think Doingbi has been getting much more in form. I think he's starting to play a lot more aggressive and a lot more like the primary option. Aki's a very aggressive player that, you know, obviously the community has mostly turned on at this point and kind of villainized, but his good games still look really good, and Leave is a very consistent carry if you can get him into a spot where making positioning mistakes don't really matter. Like, that's his biggest flaw as a player, is that sometimes he's just going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you can make that so it's not as big of a deal, where you can follow up and kind of create a positive play there, or alternatively where he can die and it's not that big of an issue, then that's going to be positive for NIP. And for FPX, this peddles the narrative that I've been pushing as well, where FPX is a team that is good. They are solid. They're certainly not a bad team, but their whole thing in Group Ascend is being able to take advantage of teams that are underperforming somewhere else. If Ninjas in Pyjamas actually show up on the day and play like the better team, they're going to win. If NIP were playing the style where they were putting themselves in bad positions, FPX are good enough to be able to take advantage of that, but they're not the kind of team that's going to choose whether or not they win or lose a game. So let's get into it. Doingbi is going to get my player of the series. This was really not a difficult decision here for Ninjas in Pyjamas. The Akali game in particular, in game number 1, he absolutely took over. We're going to talk about Care on the other side of this matchup, but boy, he got destroyed in the mid lane 1v1. So, you know, big credit to Doingbi. It's really nice to see him be a primary option for Ninjas in Pyjamas to be able to dive the backline and still be very effective. Now, Akali in general can be a pretty feast or famine pick, because if she's not able to get into the fight, it can be pretty problematic, as we talked about in that game, but luckily you had other pieces. Solo kill was really solid on the Rumble. Leave was doing a ton of damage in the backline on Varus. PP God had a couple of great setups. Even Aki was solid on the Vi. Overall, which it was just a very good game for, you know, Doingbi in game number 1, and he was still very consistent on the Victor, especially getting a gigantic gold lead in game number 2. So you got to credit him in that regard. It's just about consistency for Doingbi. His bad games are some of the worst in the LPL this year. Like, when he loses, he'll go 0-14 or whatever, and it'll look like match fixing, and that's just what you have to live with. But when he is actually on point, and, you know, when he's playing especially with the Vi, vibes and the confidence that he wants to play with, things get a lot better. I do want to give a big shout out to Aki, who I thought was really, really good in this series, especially on the Wukong in game number 2. Just completely outplayed Shadow on an Afiri pick that's looked incredible for him across this entire year. And remember, FPX obliterated Ninjas in Pyjamas on that Nefiri pick late in the, the placement stage, like the group stage at the beginning of the spring split here. So credit to Aki for being able to step back up and play a little bit better there. I know, again, he's been villainized. He's kind of been, made out to be the pariah on Ninjas in Pyjamas. It's nice to see him be able to still have good performances. Solo kill has been a massive upgrade in the top lane to Shanji. I never thought I would say that, but here we are. Even as a solo kill fan, right? Like, I was hyping up this guy's tape last year when he was on a winless EDG team. Like, to see him on Ninjas in Pyjamas outperforming a player that I thought at one point could be a top 3 top laner in the LPL is insane. Leave and PP God have been pretty consistent. Again, if you can just keep Leave from destroying his own game, he's going to be fine. NIP's good, and FPX is fine. Like, they're an okay team, but they did have some major underperformances here today. Care is the main one. He's the obvious choice for dead of the series. He got completely blasted by Doinby in lane, and, Talia, Aurora, you got to get on the map. You got to be able to make plays, and Care was just never ahead in terms of gold or pressure on the map, and that's just a death sentence for these champions and for this team. Jway is the primary playmaker for this team, having him on things like Poppy, on Nautilus, which, yes, can be primary playmaking options, but don't really give you the same kind of explosive potential that something like a Nico would give you. Now that's getting permabanned against FPX. Is that going to take away some of Jway's effectiveness? That's going to be something we continue to monitor. Assume is a player that I do not trust, like, even a little bit. I think he's the worst AD carry in Group Ascend. I think that has become very, very clear over time, and I have held that opinion for a long time. I just don't think he's a particularly good AD carry, and I think he continuously shows that because he's not really able to get his own leads, and he certainly doesn't step up when the rest of the team is underperforming. Sheer didn't get to do anything. Yorick has looked awful in the LPL in terms of the consistency. Shadow was blasted in this series. He got Nefiri in game 2 and didn't end up doing anything with it, which is never a good sign. FPX, again, are just one of those teams. They capitalize on mistakes. They don't create positive advantages on their own. That's just who they are. And then for NIP on the other side, this team has gotten better and better over the past couple of weeks. How much will it matter? I don't know, because they've dug themselves a pretty deep hole. But remember, you just have to win one best of 5 in order to make the playoffs if you're this team. As long as you can set yourself up into a position where you could potentially be playing a team like FPX, that could be an avenue for NIP to continue their upward trajectory that they're on right now. Then moving on now to day number 2, and we're sticking with Ninjas in Pyjamas as we move in to see them take on Bilibili Gaming. And BLG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win here. They keep their good run of form going. I moved them all the way up to number 2 in my power rankings at the end of last week because I really do believe that this is, on paper, one of the 2 best teams in the LPL. They've just needed to be able to get their players back on track, and at least for now, it looks like that is happening. It looks like they are back on track. Ninjas in Pyjamas put up a really good fight, and it shows that their increase in form over the past couple of weeks is not a fluke either. They definitely are playing better right now than they have in quite a long time, and they're going to make a push to be a playoff team, but BLG are just a little bit better in terms of their upgrades and in terms of their consistency. So let's go ahead and get into it. My player of the series might not be all that popular, but for me, it's going to go to Bin in the top lane. I get that Knight looked really great in game number 1 and really in game number 3 in that 2v5 essentially in the mid lane, and you can give a lot of credit to On as well. I think a lot of people are going to give On player of the series, and I totally understand. There was a pretty gigantic support gap in the games that Bilibili won in this series, and we will get into that as we go further. But to me, when I watched game number 3 and I watched how that ended up progressing and how things ended up breaking down in that one, it was really hard for me not to say that Bin was the most important player in the game on that Yorick. We've talked pretty consistently about how Yorick has not been a very consistent pick, a very successful pick at all in the LPL and the LCK, really anywhere it's been played. It's not really found what it's been looking for in terms of, being able to split push and, create a win condition. I think a lot of players are way too willing to teleport in and try and 5v5 on that champ, and then why are you even picking him in the first place? But Bin understood the assignment, he knew the win condition, and he was super relevant in game number 3. I don't think BLG end up winning that game nearly as easily without Bin playing as well on Yorick. And trust me, I'm not trying to take anything away from, the narrative right now that Bin is underperforming, and there have been a lot of really good analysts out there that have, talked a lot about the fact that Bin has not been Bin over the course of 2025. And they're right. Like, he's not been incredible for this team. But to pretend like he's been, like, one of the worst top laners in the league, I think is, at that point, just taking it way too far. Has he been top 3? Probably not, which is a pretty massive disappointment for him individually as a player. But has he been top 5 or 6? Probably. Like, he's probably somewhere within that range. He's still been decently valuable to BLG. He's just losing games for them, which hasn't necessarily happened in the last past couple of years. Again, I want to reiterate, this reminds me so much of how Ben used to play in the regular season before he joined a lot of these super teams when he was on Suning in 2020, 2021, like that era of Ben, like that's the version of him that would underperform a lot in the regular season and then step it up in the best of fives and in the playoffs to be able to really make his mark. I'm not saying that that's happening again, but especially with Beishuan coming in and really stabilizing the macro of the team, I think it could really help benefit him a lot. But again, Knight was incredible, as he has been the past couple of weeks. He's been the best player in the LPL over the past week and a half. I don't even think that's really all that debatable. It's really cool to see him back in form. On was incredible in this series, pretty ginormous support gap. Again, we'll get to that when we get to PP God on the other side, who I really am starting to get frustrated with. Elk had a couple of really nice team fights. Beishuan, while his scoreline might not look all that good, I think, created quite a few positive plays. He just put himself in some danger in order to do so, and once again, he loses another Xin Zhao game. That's become a pretty common trend, we'll just say, for BLG, but overall, it's just nice to see the main carries, the main, players of this team, Bin, Knight, On, like the players that are supposed to be the best in their role in the world, step up and actually play like it for the past couple of weeks. It's nice to see that that development has been kind of real for them. So let's move on to Ninjas in Pajamas here. Dud of the series is obviously going to go to PP God. Anybody who watched these games, I think, would kind of agree with that. He just accomplished basically nothing throughout this series, and especially when the rest of his team actually was playing relatively well. He had a couple of moments for Doingby that were really solid on the Akali. In particular, in Game 2, he pulls out his signature Kled mid. I say signature. He has so many off-meta picks at this point that you can count a bunch of different things for that, but Kled mid is certainly one of them. He pulls that out as the answer to Silas in game number 3. You even have Solo Kill playing a really nice series. Leave popped off in game 2 and had a couple of nice moments in game 3 on the Misfortune. PP God, if he was even a remotely average engaged support throughout this series, maybe Ninjas in Pajamas are actually able to win it, but he was so out-tempoed by On in terms of all of the things, especially in game number 3, that it ended up being pretty unwinnable for Ninjas in Pajamas. And that's just a bit frustrating. I think PP God sometimes escapes a bit of the criticism on this team because, Shanji and Aki have been receiving a ton of it on the top side. Doinby's bad games are pretty awful. Leave can be decently inconsistent, but PP God's not exactly been a superstar support for this team by any stretch of the imagination. And in this loss, I think it was pretty easy to point to him as the biggest problem in terms of where things ended up going awry for Ninjas in Pajamas, especially in their game 3 loss. So, that's how it just ends up going. On was the better support by a considerable margin, and that means that this series was pretty easily winnable for Bilibili. For Ninjas in Pajamas, it doesn't really change my reputation of them at all, my thought process on where they're at. I still think this is a team that's on the rise. I think they showed that with a game 2 win, but Bilibili is just better right now. They're in incredible form, and they're going to have more of a chance to showcase that later on in the week with some bigger matchups than this one, but already things are looking pretty fantastic for BLG in comparison to what they were looking like just a couple of weeks ago before the roster change, and that's really all you can ask for right now. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and I was really excited for this one. JD Gaming taking on Invictus Gaming, and IG decimates JDG here. This is a dominant 2-0. Both games sub 28 minutes. Really awesome stuff from Invictus. Basically everything you could ask for out of this team. I've been hesitant to put them up into the top 4, kind of considering them for that because I'm just super scared about their inconsistency. They were so bad at the beginning of the split, and nothing's really changed in terms of how this team plays the game. They're just actively not making the same kinds of mistakes now, and these players are inherently more flippy, and all of this stuff, right? Like I compare them to Weibo because I think these are teams that can go on 8 series loss streaks and then immediately go into 8 series win streaks, and I wouldn't really be surprised. But this is massive. This is a gigantic win for this team, and they did it in such a dominant fashion. And for JDG, they just got destroyed here today. I don't know how much I want to play into the idea that JDG might be overhyped at the current moment, because again, we're going to see more out of them later on in the week, but this was not a good look. This is certainly one of their weaker series of the entire year, exploiting some of the negative parts of this team that have existed for quite a while. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series is kind of up to your interpretation. Jeje dominated game number 2 on the Wukong, was incredibly fun to watch, could basically not die throughout that entire game. I mean, literally could not die. He ends up going deathless in this series, but the Wukong was incredible. But honestly, to me, it was pretty obvious. I kind of had to give it to Mako here. Hits 10k assists in terms of his LPL career. That's a gigantic milestone, and he was incredible throughout this series. It's not like he didn't mega gap missing on the other side of this. So Mako ends up getting player of the series for me. I just think he's been bad, quite frankly, for Invictus. I know that's not the direction that many people probably thought I was going, but when you look at this split so far, it's honestly like these two teams are pretty comparable, where both of them have AD carries that are trying their best to carry the team, and then everything else has been decently inconsistent. They have junglers that when they look great, look incredible. Shun and Jeje have both been near the top of the leaderboards in terms of what they've been able to do, but when they're off their game, the inconsistencies really start to appear. Top laners that have really underperformed and mid laners that I think are slightly better than people give them credit for at the current moment, but if one of those, quote-unquote weaker links are going to be able to step up and be a bit more consistent in a series like this, that is going to be the gigantic difference maker, and that's what Mako was for Invictus. Again, I'm happy for Mako, and this is a player that last year I couldn't stop glazing. I mean, I was going on and on about how well Mako was playing, about how he was a jack of all trades, master of all. In terms of his gameplay style, he was perfect for the modern game of League of Legends because he's a good roamer, he's a good laner, he's a good team fighter, he can do everything at a pretty decent level, not just decent, at a very above average level, and then everything kind of fell off this year. The wheels were, off of the cart, we'll just say, for Mako this year, but it's nice to see him getting back into form, and he is a big pivot point, in my opinion, for whether or not Invictus is going to be consistent throughout this year. If he can step up and be one of the better supports in the world, which we know he can be. Last year, he was the best support in the world. I will die on that hill in terms of the production he was putting out. If he can get back to being a top 10 support in the world, which is all we're really asking of him, I think Invictus becomes a significantly more terrifying option to potentially even fight for top 2. I'm not even joking. That really is kind of the ceiling for this team if they can figure it out, but especially with Jeje being in such good form, I think he's honestly underrated right now in the LPL. A lot of people are talking about other junglers as being, way more consistent than Jeje, players like Shun on the other side of this, and I just don't know if I'm on that. I think Jeje has really been that good across this year, and he's certainly been that important. I understand during their losing streak, he wasn't exactly as valuable as maybe you would want, but when the Shy and Rookie and Mako are running it down relatively consistently for the team, you need a jungler that's going to be able to step up, and that's what Jeje was for this team. So I'm going to continue to push the narrative that he's been like a top 3, top 4 jungler in the LPL across this year, because I very much believe that. Gall has been sensational across the past few weeks. I think he's really been the player that has stepped up the most for Invictus over, this course of time that they've been on their win streak, and they just need him to be able to continue that. Rookie has started to find his style. He stopped playing a lot of things like Aurora and Yone and, these more aggressive picks, and just settled back into playing things like Talia and Annie that he played, a decade ago. That's the stuff that's been working for him. Orianna has also been a pretty massive pick. Azir has been a pretty massive pick for him that Scout ended up picking on the other side, just simplifying things. And then the Shy didn't run it, and that's all they really need from him on the top side. He was excellent in this series, and he dominated Ala in terms of the 1v1, but really, again, the Shy doesn't have to win like that on the top side for this team to be successful. He just can't lose in the way that he has at times in the past. So huge win for IG, huge dominant win that really kind of solidifies them near the top of the LPL. And for JD Gaming, this is a pretty embarrassing loss, but it does come off the back of a lot of narratives we've already started pushing for this team. First of all, Missing has just been bad in 2025. He's going to get dead of the series. I was already pretty out on Missing coming off of 2024. I think he was one of the biggest reasons that team ended up missing the World Championships last year alongside Yagao, who I just didn't think played particularly well, but Missing is not adapted to this meta very well. I think specifically, and I'm not trying to pinpoint this as like the one thing that Missing can do, because we've seen him have good performances on this, yada, 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 but he's just not built to be a top tier engaged support player. Like, that's just not who he is. He was always at his best in 2022, 2023, in these enchanter metas, where he could kind of pull out a lot of these more hyper carry-esque bot lanes and play for the late game. That's where Missing ended up thriving, play for, the 2v2 in the laning phase. Now that he has to play Rel and Nautilus and move around the map, he's just worse at that than a lot of other supports in the league right now. And when you're asking him to be such an integral part of this team, be one of the best supports in the world, he's not really in that zone at the current moment, and I don't think he's going to be able to get there. The biggest negative for me is that Pays ended up having a really bad series. If he's going to underperform and not play particularly well, if he's going to be the weaker AD carry in a series, JDG is doomed. He is like 90% of this team's success rate at this point. Even with Shun playing fine and Scout not necessarily being awful this series, Ala got destroyed on the top side here, and, he's also been a weakness for this team. JDG is just a very finicky team, kind of like Invictus on the other side. The problem for JDG is they rely so much on their top-end talent in Pays and Shun to be able to win them games that when they aren't winning, it's doomed. And that could end up holding them back, especially as we get further along into these best of fives. But it's a big win for Invictus, and this might put them in the upper echelon. Again, it's pretty open right now at the top of the standings. Nobody's been particularly consistent, and on any given day, I could see Invictus being able to beat anybody. And if that's the case, get them hot going into playoffs, all of a sudden you might be looking at a team that could make some sort of run to MSI. Then moving on now to day number 3, and as we did at the end of day 1, going into day 2, we're having a back-to-back for a team, this time JD Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and JDG gets some confidence back as they pick up a 2-0 victory over a Weibo team that's been in complete freefall mode over the past couple of weeks. I don't even think Weibo played all that bad in this series. Unfortunately for them, they just didn't have the 2 best players on the Rift, which ended up being Pyjamas and Allah on the top side of the map, and that's really what separated JDG and kind of got them the victory in this one, which is huge for them. But there are still some negatives to talk about. This still is a team that I really do not believe in at a super high level because of the inconsistency of, you know, straight up the weak links of the team. I think it's fair to say that. It's just really hard to win, even if you have the best players on the Rift, if you consistently have the weakest players on the Rift. That being said, sometimes the best players are good enough for you to be able to overcome that, and I think that that was the case here for JDG. So let's go ahead and get into it. Pyjamas is player of the series. I mean, come on, man. Like, what do you even want me to say? He was awesome in game number 1 on the Kaisa. That was already a game where it's like, Pyjamas is pretty good, huh? And then he has that fight on Kalista in game number 2. Now, I'm gonna be, you know, completely real with you guys. It wasn't perfect. Like, there were some clicks there that I think could have been more optimized, and it's not like you're looking at that play and saying that no other AD carry in the world makes that play, but I think very few AD carries in the world make that play, and more specifically, the fact that the play was made for a team in JD Gaming that really needed some player to be able to step up and be kind of the hyper carry for them. It's just a really good sign, and it's a really good idea that Pyjamas can be that guy. It's the showcase, more so than anything else, that Pyjamas can exist as a pivotal piece for JD Gaming in that regard, and we already knew that. Like, I've been calling him the best AD carry in the LPL for quite a while, basically the entirety of this year in terms of the production, but I think he's just proving that to be correct, and I'm glad to have had that take 4 months ago and have that age as well as it has over the past 4 months. So credit to Pyjamas, he is the best player on the Rift, and he continues to prove it. He is JD Gaming. If he steps up, this team is going to be a threat. But luckily for them, it wasn't just him in this series. I thought Allah actually played really well on the top side. Breathe was super aggressive on the other side, which we kind of know Breathe to be. He's been that feast or famine top laner that has looked amazing in terms of the statistics that he's been able to put up. His good games look phenomenal, but you just kind of know that the bad games are going to be coming because that's just Breathe individually as a player. But Allah was more valuable this series by a pretty considerable margin, especially in game number 2 on the Yorick, where once again, that champion actually looked pretty relevant if you were going to get him into a side lane. Now, Allah didn't exactly play it perfectly because he was teleporting into a lot of the fights that maybe he doesn't need to teleport into, but overall, it ended up working out because Pyjamas was able to take over. Now, everybody else on JDG, they have their own sets of problems. I think Scout was generally fine, was definitely the better mid laner in this series. Shun was fine, I guess, overall. I didn't love the way that he played some of the early games here for JDG, but certainly made it count at the end of game number 2 on the Lilia. But kind of the rare circumstances coming in here where Missing is actually going to get my dud of the series on the winning team. There's just no other way for me to look at this. If they had a different support, I actually think this team could be top 2 in the LPL. I really do think that that is kind of the difference maker right now, but Missing is just not playing at a level that's even remotely LPL worthy, especially when his AD carry is popping off in all of these fights. To look at how Missing is playing some of these exchanges and seeing him do basically nothing throughout a majority of this game, it's so frustrating. Like, the bailout coming in that team fight for Kalista in game 2 is massive. There was one team fight where he ended up hitting the hostile takeover onto Tibbers, and that just straight up killed the Annie, which is really funny. It's, again, a nice exchange, but outside of that, can you find any play this game that Missing made that wasn't just completely normal and completely average? Like, even a below average player could make those kinds of plays. Like, there's just nothing else to see here. I'm just so underwhelmed by what Missing has been for JD Gaming, and to me, he's the biggest pivot point, once again, of whether or not this team is actually going to be competitive near the top of the standings. They need him to step up. For now, Pyjamas is doing enough to be able to lift this team, but there is an inherent ceiling on that kind of playstyle. That will never beat the best teams in the region. They need to get everybody to perform at that level, not just 1 or 2 players. And then for Weibo on the other side, it's just pretty obvious to talk about where things went right and where things went wrong for them. They were good at getting resources, and they were bad at being able to utilize those resources to do anything. I think a couple of team fights really went awry for them. If you wanted to give them a dud of the series, Xiaohu was the pretty obvious answer for that in the mid lane. His form has cooled off considerably, although I don't think it's nearly as bad as some people will say it's been. He's not a good laner. He's never been a good laner. Even when he's in good form, he's not in a good laner. So people will point to his statistics and talk about how they don't look particularly good when he was playing at his best, when we were talking about him as one of the better mid laners in the world, you know, in 2020, 2021, 2019, like that era. His stats weren't good then either. Like, it's just, he's not a player that really indexes into that part of the game. He's a great team fighter. Unfortunately, in this series, he kind of got blasted in some of these team fights because he was short range in a lot of these fights. So overall, not a great series. series from him, but outside of that, like, it's hard to really criticize what Weibo did. Breathe was super greedy, super feast or famine on the top side, but for the most part, it actually was kind of worth it for the team. Tien has kind of been too inconsistent for me to really view him as a top-tier jungler. Even coming off of an MVP season last year, I really had high expectations for what he was going to be for this team, but he has just been a straight-up downgrade to what Tarzan was for them last year. Light is Light. He's totally fine. He's going to be okay in these team fights, but Pays, if he's playing at a high-end level, is going to be better than him. And Erhai will continue to kind of keep the same idea on, where he's fine. He's a good support at this level. I think he has proven that he can be productive in the LPL, but do I think he is like a guaranteed upgrade for this team? No, I just think that he's another support to come through the Weibo system. They've had a billion of these over the past couple of years, and they've all played basically exactly the same. So for Weibo, this losing streak I think has been disappointing, but at some point we really have to start being like, okay, well, it's time to step it up. I get that you're losing to good teams, but you got to be able to actually win some games, and they're just not doing that right now. But for JDG, I'm certainly not convinced that this team is phenomenal, especially coming off of that Invictus loss, but what I am convinced of is that Pays is really good, and sometimes that's enough. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and another pretty obvious result here is we got Top Esports taking on Team WE, and Top Esports is going to pick up the 2-0 win. No shade to WE, they're fine as a team. They've certainly overperformed expectations by a ton, but this was never supposed to be close. This was never expected to be close, and it wasn't close. This was a pretty dominant win for Top Esports, who have really reclaimed their spot at the top of the LPL. Not that they ever truly lost it. I think some people were concerned after their loss to Anyone's Legend that maybe they weren't number 1, that maybe they were around number 2. In fact, maybe concerned isn't the word. Some people were very excited to see that this team maybe wasn't the best team in the LPL, but bad news for LPL fans that hate Top Esports. I still think they're the best team in the LPL, and they come out and prove that here. And once again, it's the player that I think is really running the MVP conversation that steps up. Again, it's Kanavi in the jungle, who is the easy choice for player of the series. I love what Jackie Love has been doing over the past couple of weeks. I thought Crisp had a phenomenal series, and we'll get into them in a moment, but Kanavi really has been the anchor and kind of the player who has run a lot of what Top Esports have wanted to do across this year, and I honestly think at this point he's starting to get a bit underrated. I know people are looking at the MVP conversation and, you know, seeing Tarzan up there with him, seeing, you know, a couple other players kind of hovering around where he's at in terms of his MVP count, and obviously in the LPL, it's entirely based on your MVP count, who wins the MVP at the end of the split. For me, though, if I'm looking at just the overall value that's been added, especially considering placements, it's not even really all that close. Kanavi has been the most valuable player in the LPL, and it's been really fun to watch. I'm excited to see him be able to take over on things like Nefiri, and obviously it's pretty unfair to give the best jungler in the league Nefiri in game number 1. Pretty bad draft decision there overall from WE, but he still did really well in the Xin Zhao in game number 2, and honestly, you could argue game 2 was the better game from him, and that's just how impressive he was here. When he's able to dominate, he looks incredible, and again, he's kind of running that MVP conversation for me right now, even if that's not the most popular opinion in the world. Do want to give a huge shout out to the bot lane, Jackie Love and Crisp for this team. Jackie Love's been on fire as of late. He's looked like one of the best players in the world over the past 3 or so weeks. Really excited to see him in particular back in form. Not to say that he was ever really out of form, more so that Top Esports has kind of just accepted the fact that he's going to receive a ton of resources in the early game from the enemy team, that they're going to put a lot of time and effort into trying to shut him down and take him out of his comfort zone, and he's going to have to do his best to stay relevant no matter what. The good thing about Jackie Love is he is such a good late game team fighter that it honestly does not matter that he's down in resources for a lot of these games. He's able to be more useful than his opposition, basically no matter what ends up happening in the early game, and that's already impressive enough as it is. Crisp was awesome in this series. I loved how he played Karma in game number 2. Ezreal Karma is typically saved as like an answer to Kalista, certainly an answer to these bot lanes that want to dominate early in the 2v2, but this time it was into Ashe, which I can kind of understand the thought process of, and especially if you can trust Jackie Love and Crisp to be as strong in the mid game as they were. You know, obviously it ends up really working out in their favor there, but the Renata was also fantastic from Crisp, who has very quietly arguably been like the best support in the entire league this year. People aren't talking about him enough because, you know, Crisp has gained a reputation of being a bit more of a feast or famine player, but the good plays still are incredible from him. 369 looks solid on the top side, especially on the Scion in game number 1. There's some memes about that game, but the Ornn was really nice in game 2. You know, Cube had a performance, which we will talk about, and Cream was certainly not the problem. Like, there was no issue this game for Top Esports. They just looked incredible across this entire series, and that is to be expected from a team that is way better and way more talented than WE. And credit to WE. You know what? This is a team that has been way more competitive across this year than we ever anticipated them being, but it's a bit of a difference going into Top Esports, who were just kind of built differently. There's really no other way to say that. Taiyun in the bot lane has been really good for WE, and you want to give him a ton of credit because he has stepped up a lot. Monkey, in my opinion, is still the most important player on WE in terms of their success rate. He couldn't really generate a ton in this series, which ended up really being a negative, but for WE, at least for me, dud of the series is going to go to Cube in the top lane. Not really a ton to talk about here in terms of an individual, play or performance coming in from Cube. It's mostly just he didn't get to do anything on the Yorick in game number 1 because his team was getting slaughtered elsewhere on the map, and he couldn't split push and really create anything on his own. And then he was really bad on the Renekton in game number 2, which did really end up kind of putting WE back in a couple of bad spots. I think you could realistically give this to Karis in the mid lane. I'm certainly not going to be upset by that. I think you could give this to Vampire in the support position. Really, to me, one of the big standout things for this series was just how bad WE's macro was, or maybe if you want to flip that, how good top esports macro was at being able to just pressure things around the map that WE had no response to. It's obviously the sign of a good team, at least at this level, in my opinion, and WE had no clear-cut answer for that. Whoever you want to blame, I think that was the biggest issue for the side of WE here, but all of that being said, them getting destroyed and blown out by the best team in the league, is anyone particularly surprised by this? This shouldn't be any sort of shocking outcome. This is kind of what we all anticipated, and for top esports on the other side, it's just another nice win at the top of the standings to be able to build your case. You're going in right now as the number 1 seed pretty easily. You've already locked playoffs, top 4, no matter what, but if this team can get that number 1 spot to get themselves an even better, standing and placement going into top 8, I think that that's obviously going to be the best case scenario for them. Then moving on now to day number 4, our middle day of the week here, as per usual, in the LPL, and it starts off with a matchup between Anyone's Legend and Ninjas in Pyjamas, and AL is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Credit to NIP for being able to take a game off of Anyone's Legend. I think you can continue to look at solo kill being very useful for this team, this time on the Yorick in game number 2, and generally just being a really big positive for them, but AL is simply too good for Ninjas in Pyjamas to be able to overcome. It's a very similar story to what we talked about earlier this week when they played against Bilibili Gaming, where when they go up against the best teams in the league, regardless of the fact that they are definitely playing better right now than they have been as of late, they just don't necessarily have the talent level to be able to overcome that mechanical difference. And for AL, they still are one of the best teams in the entire league. Perhaps I was too bullish putting them down at number 3. We will see later on in the week how that ends up aging, but for now, they look fantastic coming out at the beginning of week number 7. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Hope in the bot lane. Finally, I get to give one of these to Hope. It feels like I never necessarily get to kind of move in his direction when it comes to player of the series, but this time I did definitely get to, go there, and it's mostly for the 2 wins, right? Obviously, he was spectacular on the Jhin in game number 1. I don't think I need to explain to you why that game ended up getting a lot of praise from him. He was phenomenal as a backline damage dealer, but I don't think he's getting enough praise for how he played in game 3 on the Kalista. I know Flandra's getting a lot of talk because he was better than solo kill in that 3rd and final game, and that was a big difference maker between game 2 and game number 3, but game number 3 for Hope was still phenomenal on the Kalista. We've actually seen multiple players now, Pays included, take over on that champion later on in games. Hope was able to really snowball the game out of control very quickly once he got resources, so credit to him. I just thought he was spectacular, way better than Leave on the other side of this matchup in this series, which we will definitely talk about. But Hope, excited for him, man. He's just been super consistent across this year. He's shown no sign that this is like a fluke for him. Obviously, it's a bit of a breakout year in terms of individual performances, even considering the fact that this guy has been to World semifinals before, but it looks like he's going to be able to keep it up. It doesn't look like it's something that's going to fall off as the year goes along. The rest of the team is also solid. Like I said, Flandra's getting a lot of praise for that Jace game in game number 3, where he did affect the matchup quite a bit because he held the best player on Ninjas in Pyjamas right now to a lesser laning phase on the Mbessa with solo kill on the other side. I thought Tarzan was by far the better jungler in this series. We will talk about that. That has more to do with Tarzan and less to do with Aki. I have a pretty hot take when it comes to Aki, and I'm excited to go over it. Shanks was awesome in this series, racked up damage and kills across all 3 of these games, specifically in game number 1 on the Azir, and Kale in the bot lane has continued to really kind of propel Hope forward, and I think is a big reason why he's having a big, breakout star-making split. So, nice win for AL, pretty standard stuff, but for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, a pretty easy discussion, in my opinion, and considering what we've talked about with this team up until this point. I'm sorry, Aki is getting a little bit scapegoated for this team, and I'm not saying that that is entirely the case. He is going to get done of the series, again, and I know I say this every single time that Aki has a bad series, which actually happens relatively often, but Aki, I think it's just being misrepresented by the fact that NIP have such high expectations. There was a comment where it's like, oh, NIP, I think this was on Reddit, it could have been on Twitter, I don't actually remember, it was a couple of days ago, but there was a comment that was like, oh, NIP is losing all of these series to top teams 1 to 2, like this could be a team that goes to Worlds, and it's that mentality that I think is so inherently misguided. Like, respect to NIP, this is not even close to a Worlds team at the moment. I think you would be insane to consider them a team that's going to compete for the World Championships in the way that they exist at the current moment, but like that mentality is what's causing Aki to kind of be vilified by a lot of the LPL community. Aki is a top 10 jungler in the league. Like, he is a jungler that probably deserves to be in Group Ascend. The problem is that he's not quite at the level of like Doingby and Solo Kill and Leave and PP God, you know, all the time. And so he's put in this position where against junglers that he's way better than, he is able to kind of outclass them, and he does look really good. We saw that earlier in the week when they played against FPX. He was way better than Shadow. He looked excellent in that series, but when he has to go up against Tarzan, who I've said over and over again, I have a strong take is the best jungler in the world, and he's kind of proved that over the course of this year. Like, he just can't keep up with players like Tarzan, and that's not really the fault of Aki. I think it's just the expectation of Ninjas in Pyjamas fans that Aki is a player that he isn't. This isn't a guy that's ever going to be competing to be a top 5 jungler in the LPL anymore. Outside of 2023, he's never even really been in that conversation. The thing about him is just that he's going to be pretty consistent at being able to survive against, you know, bottom tier junglers, and that's just not really what the goal is for NIP. And so yes, like, I do understand Aki has been bad, but all of this talk about Aki being unplayable at the LPL level in the same way that, you know, Hang was for OMG, or, you know, even a lot of the players on like RNG have been that I've kind of talked about, you know, even someone like Hoya or Satab on Thunder Talk. Like, I think it's just ridiculous. He's infinitely better than those players. He's just not quite at the level that NIP need him to be at, and that's not his fault. He's just in over his head. He should be replaced on this team, but to pretend like he's an awful player that has no business being in the LPL, I think it's just a gross misunderstanding of who Aki is individually as a player. And that's also ignoring the fact that the rest of this team wasn't perfect here. PP God continues to basically be nothing down in the support position. I've really not been impressed with him at all this year. Leave had a really bad game number 3 on the Zeri. I know that's not necessarily going to show up in the stat sheet, but man, go watch his positioning. This dude cannot position to save his life. It's like a true hindrance on his game. He is really good at almost everything else when it comes to League of Legends. When it comes to actively being in the right place, he's awful at that. I just don't understand why it is such a negative for him. Doingby picked Karma mid in game number 3 to play around this hyper carry in the bot lane. It just feels like this team is very disconnected right now and doesn't really have a great idea. And for all those people that are like, oh, they lost 1-2 to AL, they're in a position to compete for Worlds, like, I need you to go, like, figure something out, because it's not happening, man. Like, maybe I'm wrong, and I hope this ages entirely poorly. I hope somebody posts a comment on this video in 4 months that's like, you look like an idiot because Ninjas in Pyjamas just made finals. Like, I hope that that's the case. I hope that ends up being true, but right now, this team is so far away from competing even for top 5, let alone top 3 or top 4, that I don't even think it's worth having them in the conversation. And then for AL on the other side, like, they're really good. Like, this is what a top, you know, 2, top 1 kind of team in the LPL looks like. It's really good from top to bottom, no weaknesses, and very little inconsistency coming in from this team. They've just been fantastic across this year, and this is what it's supposed to look like when you're one of the best teams in the LPL. Then moving on now to our second series of day number 4, and it was a matchup between Team WE and Thunder Talk Gaming, and WE is going to pick up the 2-0 victory here. They kind of dominate this series. I think that there was some pushback in game number 2, but most of it ended up just kind of fading into the ether after a really bad mid lane pick ends up being capitalized on in a really big way, but we will talk about that because WE kind of ends a little bit of a losing streak here for themselves. Both of these teams not coming into this series as hot as they could possibly be. Neither have necessarily found the success that maybe they were expecting. You know, neither of them were particularly predicted to have a ton of success in Group Ascend, but both definitely near the bottom, and WE kind of proving that, no, we're not bottom 1 like Thunder Talk is. They are clearly the worst team in Group Ascend right now, and a lot of that is just through some great team play. I think that there is a lot to talk about in a positive light here. A couple of players that I really want to highlight, and that's starting with Taiyun down in the bot lane, who's going to get player of the series for me for WE. So funny to see kind of the turnaround that he's been able to make. He was always a scrim demon. That was always kind of the narrative on him coming out of the LCK and even coming out of the Challengers League when he was playing for, you know, KDF and, you know, for a couple of teams DRX, you know, back in the day in their Challengers League roster. He was always this scrim demon that was never able to show it on stage, and everybody was so impressed by what he was able to do in practice. And then he would go to the LCK and get a shot at tier 1 and be the worst AD carry by a ginormous margin. I've said it once, I'll say it again on this channel. What his time in the LCK is the worst graded player I've ever graded on this channel. There has never been a player that has performed as badly as Taiyun performed in the LCK at any major region, at least as far as I've been tracking a lot of the data that I've been tracking. That's just how bad he was individually for that Guangdong Freaks team. So when WE imported him, you know, I lambasted them for it. Same thing with Karis coming into the mid lane. I just didn't feel good about the decisions that this organization was making, but they've clearly figured out how to translate some of that performance that he showed off of stage onto stage, because he's been much better here in spring than he ever has been at any point in his entire career. He's finally showing the consistency that we've been waiting for out of an AD carry. Both games, he was the better ADC here, and everybody loves 1xN. I know I've been a bit of a 1xN hater, and I'll kind of get into that as we go throughout this, but Taiyun was better. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate, and I'm not saying he projects to be better in the future, but he's certainly showing much more high-end traits than 1xN has ever shown on the other side. So credit to him. I want to give a big shout out to Top Jungle as well. Cube was really solid on the Cassante. I think Cassante is a pretty bad pick right now. I think he's been nerfed into the ground, and generally speaking, I think that champion takes a lot in order to make relevant in the same kind of way. I think the only way you're ever going to find a ton of value from him is if you can play those late game team fights from relatively neutral, which is kind of hard to do right now, but Cube got there. He was neutral because Hoya's really bad on the other side, and he was very useful on the Cassante. And then Monkey's the other player you have to shout out. Xiao Huanggren was one of the players that was actually trying on the side of Thunder Talk, and Monkey was still the better jungler, specifically on the Xin Zhao in game number 1. So credit to him there. Karis' scoreline looks pretty good. I think a lot of that was taking advantage of Seitab, who was entirely useless in this series. Vampire was also, you know, up and down. I think most of the engages were actually pretty solid from him, but Taiyun doing a lot more of the heavy lifting, in my opinion. So we win once again. WE get back into the win column, and they are clearly not the worst team in Group Ascend. That honor squarely lies on the shoulders of Thunder Talk on the other side of this, who they're just bad. Like, there's nothing else even really to say about this team at this point. Seitab is going to get dead of the series for me in the mid lane. Like, people are going to highlight the Hui, and trust me, I think the champion is not particularly useful right now. I certainly don't think he's quite as useful as he's been in the past, but you still can pilot him in a way that makes him somewhat useful, and Seitab just didn't do that. Like, this guy just cannot play at this level right now. He has regressed even from what he was in the winter split, which was already not particularly good for this team outside of that one random series against Bilibili Gaming. So, you know, I'm worried about Thunder Talk. I'm worried about Seitab. He's right now on pace to easily win Dud of the Week for week number 7, and obviously we'll talk about that a bit more as we go along, but it's not like Hoya was any better on the top side. He got completely outplayed by Cube in game number 2, and if that's happening, if you're getting outplayed by Cube, who's already not a player I believe in a ton, that's very bad. 1xN and Feather were not the problem here, but this kind of just ties into everything I've been saying about 1xN, where he really is a player that is good at a lot of things, and he's that jack of all trades, master of none type of playstyle, and it's why I have a really hard time projecting him to ever be like a top tier AD carry. People talk about him as if he should be going to a better team than Thunder Talk. He's a top 8 or 9 AD carry in the league, but is that better than what Thunder Talk is at right now? I mean, that's a really hard thing to say. So yeah, is 1xN the best player on this team? Yes. Does that say a whole ton? Probably not. Feather is pretty good as well, and honestly, you could argue that Feather has shown more high-end upside traits than 1xN has individually as a player. Xiao Huanggren at least was aggressive in this series, even if it often came back to bite him in terms of where he was at, but Thunder Talk just don't have a consistent thing to run through. They don't really have a game plan. They don't really have a style that they can play through right now, and WE took full advantage of that. They just look good across the map. They were the better team by a considerable margin. It was just a really nice win for them, and it's nice to see them, you know, get back into the win column in pretty dominant fashion. Then moving on now to day number 5, and starting in our second half of the week, or traditionally what is the second half of the week in the LPL, is a matchup between FunPlus, Phoenix, and JD Gaming. The JDG are going to be able to take 2-0 in this one. Again, just trying to get back on track. That's the name of the game for JDG at this point moving forward. You just need to be able to pick up the wins in the matchups that you should be winning in. Again, this team is top 4 as long as they are capable of not ending out this split horribly, and they're at least on pace to do that right now, regardless of the ups and downs. For FunPlus, I don't know how much more I can say on this team. I've said the same thing over and over and over and over again when it comes to them, where it's like, yes, if the enemy team underperforms, they can win. If the enemy team doesn't underperform, they're not going to win. It's just such a standard format at this point for them that it's pretty easy to talk about. But let's go ahead and get into this particular series for JDG. Player of the series for me is going to go to Shun in the jungle. The Nefiri in particular in game number 1 was absolutely devastating. I find it so odd that so many of these like bottom bottom tier Group Ascend teams are so willing to give over the best jungler in the game to one of the best junglers in the game. It just feels so weird. It happens so regularly. Players like Tarzan and Shun, like, why are they the ones that get Neferi regularly? Why are we giving this over to weaker players? It just seems like it's exclusively the good teams that end up being able to take away this champion, and I know the champion works on bad teams. We've seen it all year long work for teams like Ultra Prime, so just feels strange to me, but Shun coming out and dominating in both games, really, but specifically in game number 1 on the Neferi. Again, he's somehow getting a bit underrated, I think, in terms of the community sentiment surrounding him individually as a player. He's been one of the best junglers in the LPL across this year, and he has certainly not been the problem on JDG. Even if he's not the most consistent player in the world, somehow he's probably the second most consistent player on this team outside of Pays, which is always pretty nice. I also want to give a big shout out to Allah on the top side. Really nice series from him. You know, I'm sure he felt like he had something to prove here because he came in and replaced Sheer on JD Gaming, and quite frankly, Sheer's been better for a large majority of this year than Allah has been on the other side. That's not quite been the case in Group Ascend because Sheer has definitely cooled off quite a bit and Allah has been better than he was at the beginning of the year, but this was kind of that statement message of like, no, you made the right decision. You brought in the right player, regardless of if that has been true across the entire year or not. The Yorick looked really nice in game 2. The Scion was super consistent in game number 1. Overall, it was just a pretty solid performance from him on the top side. Scout was even really good in this series. We really haven't talked all that much about Scout across this split, and I mean that in both a good and a bad way. You're kind of expecting him to be one of those upper tier mid laners that can compete to really make this team top 2 or top 3. He's not been that for this team, and in that case, he's been a bit disappointing, but when you're talking about the negatives for this team, you're also not very often bringing up Scout. He's really not been the issue. He's just kind of been there along for the ride in the mid lane. He's made some bad plays. There have been some 1v1 moments you can point out and some gold deficits that have been created by him, but for the most part, he's been pretty solid across this split, even if you're expecting more out of Scout in that regard. But the Sylas in game number 2, one of the first times in quite a while where I've been like, oh, okay, that's Scout. Like, I remember Scout. He's a really good player. He's one of the best mid laners in LPL history, and I think he did kind of show that off. Now, that being said, Care was awful across this entire week, so there is that, but at least Scout looked good there, and this was easily Missing's best series of the entire week. The Renata, the Alistair, both of them looked really solid for him, specifically the Renata in game number 1. Just finally excited to see Missing actually perform well in his series. Again, I don't want this guy to fail. I don't want to be negative towards him as a player, but I just kind of feel like I have to be because he's performed so bad across this year. Pays is obviously super consistent as a carry, but it's finally time for Missing to at least play like an average support at this level. So nice win for JD Gaming. Again, their goal right now is just to secure their spot in the top 4 and then go from there. And for FPX, you know, they're going to try to build as much momentum as possible. They're not the worst team in Group Ascend, but they're pretty darn close, which I think you can see in a lot of the series that they end up playing. They just don't really have any top-tier talent here. Jway, I think, could theoretically become that in the support position, but he's playing with an AD carry that I think is quite bad in Assume, in my opinion, the worst AD carry in Group Ascend, and that makes it a bit more difficult for him to have those same kind of flashy moments because their 2v2 really isn't all that good. You're relying on Jway to get out on the map and create plays elsewhere, and when Shadow is losing as hard as he was in the jungle in this series, that becomes even more difficult. Shadow is dud of the series, and he's gotten a lot of these over the course of this split. I think this is his 4th dud of the series, but he's also gotten 3 player of the series. He's kind of been the feast or famine, like, pivot point for FPX, if you will. He's going to look really good when he's able to establish tempo and actually play from his own, like, decision making, and he's going to look pretty bad when he has to play on somebody else's time, which is kind of what happened in this series against Shun, but, you know, it's Shun. Like, it's JD Gaming. I'm not surprised to see Shadow underperforming. I'm more so concerned with Care in the mid lane, who just did not have a good week at all, and again, Care is like the definition of a league average mid laner to me. He does some things okay, he does other things not very okay, and that overall kind of puts him in a position where sometimes he looks good and sometimes he looks really, really bad. The really bad moments I think stand out a bit more in my mind, but I'm not going to pretend like Care has not also been successful in the LPL before. It just didn't happen here. Sheer got outplayed by Allah on the top side, a player that I thought Sheer, quite frankly, should have been able to beat in terms of the 1v1, especially in these matchups. He just didn't really get the opportunity to do so. Wasn't a great look for FPX, but again, nobody's really expecting all that much out of FPX. For them to be better than Thunder Talk sitting around the number 9 team in the LPL, I think that that's an okay outcome considering what their roster is. And for JD Gaming, they should not be struggling against a team like FunPlus Phoenix, and they didn't struggle in this series, and that is probably the best sign that they've gotten in a while. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and a matchup that's quickly turned into a bit of a rivalry so far in 2025. It's Invictus Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and IG is going to pick up the 2-0 win and actually be able to beat Ninjas in Pyjamas for the first time in 2025. And IP have really had their number, even going back to the group stage in the winter split when they couldn't quite take them down. But Invictus are red hot right now, white hot, whatever you want to say. They are burning up in terms of the standings, and they are flying up the standings in terms of what they they are accomplishing at the current moment. Ninjas in Pyjamas, they're a good team. Again, they're competent. They know what they're supposed to be doing. They just don't really have the talent to be able to make it happen. Everybody's pretending like this is a team that should be near the top 5. I think you're insane if you think that. Go back to my preseason power rankings on this team, and I was saying that they should have been around number 7 or number 8. That's exactly what they are. This is not a team that should be competing for top 4, and yet somehow, some way, I think NIP fans have deluded themselves into thinking that that's going to be an option for them. So whatever, man. We'll talk about it as we continue to go along. But starting with Invictus, player of the series is super obvious. It's going to go to Jeje in the jungle. He's been phenomenal, man. Like, I'm tired of sitting here talking about Invictus and not bringing him up as regularly as maybe I want to. Like, Mako's been good and bad for this team, and so we bring him up a lot because in their losses, he matters a lot, and in their wins, he matters a lot. Gala has been extra clutch, I would say, for this team. I think that's the best way to put it. Across the past couple of weeks, he's been incredible, but Jeje has been the best player on Invictus Gaming, and I think that that has become abundantly clear watching this team even more. I get it, man. Aki is the pariah for Ninjas in Pyjamas. You want to hate him. You want to drill it into your brain that everything is his fault, that there's no way this team could be bad in other areas, that it has to just be, oh, we'll replace Aki and everything will get better, and that's why Jeje's winning. No, Jeje's good on his own. I'm so tired of seeing all of these excuses, narratives, like, thrown the way of other teams. Jeje's just really, really good at League of Legends, and he ends up winning it here, and that's exactly what happened. Aki played fine in this series. He was super active on the Pantheon in game number 2, and Jeje was just straight up better on the Poppy. So credit to him. He was incredible, and he has been incredible for a while, but I will continue to shout out the bot lane because they really are a huge turning point for this team. If Gala is going to step up and be one of the best AD carries in the league, like he kind of has been across 2025, and if Mako is finally going to start, figuring out whatever's wrong with him and get into good form, that's ginormous for Invictus moving forward. And so far, at least this week, things have looked pretty solid. They looked good last week for this team as well. It's the reason they've been white hot. So jungle bot lane really stepping up, being a big positive part of this team is really nice. Rookie, I think, has been in better form. I talked about that a lot a couple of weeks ago. Again, just simplifying the process, picking Orianna again, and all of a sudden looking a lot better. It's really not all that complicated for him. As long as he's not going to be on these more aggressive picks, he's going to look a lot better as a player, and that's no slight to Rookie. It's just where he's at in his career. He needs to play the things he feels comfortable on, and not the things that everybody's telling him are meta right now. The Shy obviously has some plus and minus moments. I think even in this series, you saw some negatives when it came to him versus Solo Kill, who has been a positive for the other side, but, the Shy is good enough to still make plays that matter, and you put him on Yorick or Galio or whatever, and he's going to be useful no matter what, so credit him in that regard. But Invictus is incredible right now. You can make the argument that they're top 3 in the LPL. Hell, honestly, again, number 2 to number 6, or I guess really number 5 in the power rankings, pretty close. Like, they're all really right up there. There are many teams that could end up falling into a couple of different spots when it comes to where you want to end up having them land, and Invictus is right in the mix for that. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, I'm frustrated with the community. There's nothing else to say, and every single year I get like this for one team in the LPL, because LPL fans just delude themselves into thinking that teams need to be competitive if they have big names on them. This is not a team that should be fighting to go to Worlds. They're just not. They're not that talented, and I guess they overperformed too much in the winter split. I guess that probably gave some fans false hope. This is not a team that should be competing for top 4 on paper, and it shouldn't be surprising that they're getting outplayed by a team like Invictus Gaming. I'm sorry, like, I just, maybe I'm coming off too harsh, but it's just where we're at. Aki is getting, death threats like he's the worst player in the history of the universe, and it's like, this wasn't even his fault. And I just want to talk to all these Ninjas in Pyjamas fans and ask them, do you genuinely believe, are you going to look me in the eye and tell me that if Aki got swapped out for, I don't know, Leon, or whatever jungler you want to put in there, you genuinely think this team would go from that to being a Worlds team? Like, that's honestly what you believe. If you believe that, I'm sorry, I just think you're crazy. And I get that there's a bit of, like, recency bias to kind of tilt people in favor of, like, well, roster change equals doing well, but look at the roster changes. It's Shanji, who was doing nothing on the top side for a player in Solo Kill, who has been a huge upgrade for them. It's Beishwan, who might not be as mechanically talented as Wei, but is a much better macro presence and plays for his lanes a lot more to start unlocking Bin and Knight. Like, these are obvious changes that end up obviously working. Aki swapping out for a more aggressive jungler, you really think that that's going to change things? Like, Aki is a middle of the pack, like, average jungler at this level. Unless you're getting one of the upper tier guys, who, by the way, are just not available, it's not going to get better for this this team, and he wasn't even the problem here. PP God's getting dud of the series for me. His Maokai in game 2 was entirely useless. There was nothing positive to take away from that. You could even give dud of the series to Doinb in the mid lane. I'm certainly not going to complain about that. He didn't really do anything here. Leave had a pretty bad week and has certainly played worse across the last couple of weeks than he did at the beginning of the split. Like, there are so many things to focus on for Ninjas in Pyjamas that they need to fix, but yet the entire conversation is surrounding one player and pretending that that's the issue. And I wish I could say that this is some sort of isolated incident, but every year we go through this in the jungle for one team. You know, it's been Tarzan in the past. It's been a player like Beishwan in the past. It was Tarzan in 2023 for LNG. It was Beishwan last year for Thunder Talk, and now it's Aki. Again, I'm not trying to say that Aki is going to be as good as those players are, or as successful as those players are, but trying to sit here and pretend as if he's the only issue on a team that has a myriad of issues is just incompetence in terms of analysis, and I'm not going to fall into that trap. So it is what it is. Again, maybe that ages incredibly poorly. Maybe they replace Aki, get another jungler, and make worlds, and I would love for that to be the case because Ninjas in Pyjamas is a very fun team to watch and to root for. I just think the entire conversation in the community right now is entirely misguided, and that's what I've spent the entire segment focusing on. But nice win for IG, I guess. Like, if you wanted to hype them up, that's really cool. Again, this team is really, really good if they play their own style. It's just really about how consistently they're able to pull it out. But then moving on now to day number 6, and that's the start of our weekend. Typically, this is where our, super days would be, but no super days in the LPL in week number 7. Just a matchup between Weibo Gaming and Top Esports. That Top Esports is going to be able to pick up a 2-0 win in, although it was a bit closer than maybe just a regular 2-0 that we've seen in a couple of other series so far this week. Kind of a fight here from Weibo Gaming, especially in game number 2, where things were actually pretty close. TN and Light were pretty strong in that game in terms of the resources that they had, even if they definitely could have played some of those later fights a little bit better. But at the end of the day, Top Esports just have better execution. Even if their early games aren't always as perfect as maybe you would want out of a team or a player, you're still mostly going to get exactly what you're looking for out of the number 1 team in the LPL. So let's get into it. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to JackeyLove in the bot lane. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. There's been a big 3 in terms of the AD carries in the LPL this year: Pays, JackeyLove, and Gala. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. They've been the 3 best, and JackeyLove has very much made his claim to be in that upper echelon. I think they're going to be fighting it out for the All-Pro spots at the end of the split, which are going to be very, very difficult to kind of narrow down to, but JackeyLove definitely deserves to be in the conversation at this point. He dominated on the Ezreal in game number 1, and to me, that was his most impressive game, but it's not like he wasn't the main character on Kai'Sa in game number 2 either. He's just been super consistent for the past couple of weeks, and I'm really excited to see that even if he gets out to like a deficit in the early game, it doesn't matter. It never affects him. He's still able to stay relevant throughout the entirety of the game. Also want to give another big shout out to Crisp. I know I kind of talked about it a bit in the first series, but he's just really good, man, and he's good at a lot of different styles. Of course, the Ezreal Karma is something that they have pulled out a couple of times now this week, and it's worked in both occasions, but the Nautilus, kind of getting back into the more engaged style supports worked really well for him in game number 2, and he set a lot of things up for JackeyLove to be able to take over. Light stepping too far forward on the Lucian in game number 2 and getting caught by Crisp is one of the defining moments of that game. So credit to Crisp. I thought he did a good job here. Kanavi was really solid in the jungle. Maybe not so much on the Trundle, but very much on the Nefiri in game number 1. Again, this goes back to the thing I said in the previous series. Why is it only the great junglers that end up getting Nefiri on this patch? Why do we keep allowing players like Kanavi to play a champion like Nefiri that if you give 2 kills, the game is over? Like, it just feels very, very strange. 369 very stable on the top side. Cream had some horrendous moments in this series where it felt like he was absolutely running it. Lucky for him, the mid laner on the other side was just as bad in terms of execution in this series, and that meant that a lot of his mistakes did not end up going very punished. But overall, still pretty nice for Top Esports. Outside of Cream, I think everybody ended up playing pretty solid here, and JackeyLove's just a menace right now. Kanavi is also in phenomenal form, as you can probably guess, and Top Esports are clearly the number 1 team in the LPL until proven otherwise. And then for Weibo on the other side, this losing streak, I should say, is very much going to continue if they're going to play like this. And I know it feels weird, but like, they're running into top-tier teams. It's not surprising to see them lose to Top Esports. It just sucks that they've had so many of these in a row, and even some of these losses they probably should have won, but it's just a little bit unfortunate because I do think that there are some positives to take away from this series with. Tien was fine, I would say, generally speaking. Maybe took too many resources on Sejuani in game number 2, but if that's what we're criticizing him for at that point, it's probably a bit moot in terms of how things are going. Yes, he could have played team fights better in the latter half of the game, but once again, keep it up or leave it to LPL fans to blame the jungler for every single one of the team's problems, regardless of if that's real or not. And then Light in the bot lane, another player who was really good good at getting resources, was very solid on the Varus in game number 1, and throughout the first half of the game was pretty solid on the Lucian in game number 2, and then steps way too far forward and throws the entire lead for Weibo. That final fight, he is completely mispositioned and costs his team the game, like really kind of takes his team out of it, which is pretty unfortunate to be able to say. But even outside of that, like I can't really blame them entirely for the team's loss because they were the reason they were in the game in the first place. But I can't blame Xiaohu. I definitely can blame Xiaohu in the middle of the map. The Galio, the Yone, it's just not a great look to see him, play against a player in Cream who's really underperforming, who played really bad in this series, and then somehow not capitalize on any of those moments and not really be useful in any context. So not really a fan of how Xiaohu played here. Erha, I think, has been pretty lackluster. I don't think he's been, bad. I'm not going to sit here and say he's been running it, but just he's certainly not as good as he was when he first entered the lineup. Not that that should surprise anybody. And then Breathe on the top side has definitely regressed from what he was at the beginning of the split. It's just not quite as good for Weibo, and that clearly means they're going to drop down in the power rankings. How much? I don't really know. I don't think they're quite as bad as their losing streak would indicate, and I think they will get better, hopefully going into playoffs and play-ins and all of that stuff, but for now, it is much more of a question mark than it was a couple of weeks ago, and it's a nice win for Top Esports, but it's not a surprising one. This team is number 1 in the power rankings, number 1 in the standings, and number 1 in terms of expectations. If they're not going to be the best team in the LPL, then I think they've wasted a lot of people's time this year. Then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and this was the big one. This was really the series of the week for me in terms of what I was looking for. It was JD Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming, and JDG pick up a gigantic 2-0 series win, and they continue to look incredible. And I'll say this, I know that they underperformed at the beginning of the week. That loss to Invictus does matter. Like, there is something in there that you can pull out, which is that if Alla and Missing, and if they look really bad, it's going to be pretty tough for that team to be able to win, regardless of how well the rest of this team plays. But I think the takeaway here from the victory over BLG is that if they do play well, if Alla comes out on top and, ends up looking better than whoever he's facing, especially a player like Bin on the other side of this matchup, if Missing can really stabilize on the bot side and the 2v2 can be really positive for JDG, all of a sudden this team is like top 2 in the entire league. That's the kind of difference that they are. Like, the difference between their good version and their bad version is like 2nd versus 5th or 6th in the LPL. So really funny to see that for BLG. This is their first hurdle, their first actual roadblock as, this group of 5, their first loss since Beishuan has come in as the starting jungler. Obviously, there are some negatives to take away from this series, but I think it's important to point out that this is their first loss as a group. They've been that good leading into this, and I'm not going to freak out and just say that the team is bad now that they lost to JD Gaming, but again, there were some flaws in this series that I think are definitely worth pointing out. So let's go ahead and get into it. Alla is going to get my player of the series on the top side of the map. Really hard for me to go in any other direction here. Shun was exceptionally good in this series for JDG, and really, he was great across this entire week for JDG, maybe even outside of that Invictus series, but he wasn't the problem against IG, I can definitely promise you that. But Alla on the top side, being able to step up and being a really big positive for this team, that's the difference maker for me. Like, when you're talking about what separates them from being one of the best teams in the league and one of the best teams in the world versus a team that's not going to make worlds, it's really about Alla on the top side. To see him play Ornn and really stabilize in game number 1, and then quite frankly just be better than Bin on the same playstyle in game number 2, ridiculously impressive stuff. I'm very excited to see that from him, and really at this point you just gotta hope that it's sustainable, because he came in supposedly as a big upgrade to players like Flandra and players like Sheer that were on this team last year. They brought Alla in because he's supposed to be better than those guys. He has not been. I think if he is going to get back to where he's been, which is a top 3 top laner in the league over the last couple of years, then that's going to be a pretty massive upgrade for this team. But how can you not also shout out Shun? Gigantic jungle gap in this series, and I think that there is obviously a narrative to take away from that, in the sense that obviously Shun had played for BLG last year. He is the only player, on that World's Finals making team from last year to not be on the team in 2025, and he comes out here and just straight up beats them, completely gaps their new jungler that's looked pretty good over the beginning part of a couple series that he's played, but this was not close. Shin was better by a very, very, very large margin. The Vi, the Pantheon, both looked incredible. I think the Vi in particular is really the game that stood out for me, but it's not like he didn't run things in game 2 with that macro as well. It's just awesome stuff, and the top side of the map really did carry JDG and put them really in a great spot. Pays continues to be the most impressive AD carry to watch in terms of the plays he's able to make on his own. Scout was really great in this series, even with Knight very much stepping up on the other side and being the best player that BLG had to offer, and Missing, like I said, pretty good here, and they played Kalista Elise, and they were able to win there. That's the biggest shocker for me. I'm the biggest Elise support hater in the entire known universe, and so for missing to be able to pull it out here against On, a team that I would consider to be more talented than JDG, and actually have one of his better games of the entire week, it's a huge surprise to me, certainly not what I was anticipating, but it's nice to see for JDG, and this win is huge for them. And then for BLG on the other side, man, top jungle just got blasted, didn't they? Like, this was not even remotely close. Bin is going to be the easy choice for dead of the series. I say that Beishwan also kind of deserves it for how he ended up playing, but let's be real here. Bin was awful, and I think, the Bin haters that have been out and vocal and really, kind of talking him down throughout a lot of this year, they won in this series. They definitely got a big W, because Allah should not be beating Bin in the Jax versus Yorick matchup in this way. It's just completely unacceptable, and Bin, quite frankly, has not been losing like this in previous years. As much as I like to talk about the fact that he would underperform in the regular season in years past, it's never quite been to the level where he's dying in side lanes as explicitly as he is this split. There are just some weird intricacies to his game that I think he's getting taken advantage of in a specific way, and it's really, really bad for BLG. That being said, he needs to get back on track, and I think that there is a realistic possibility that he does so as we continue to go further, but for now, this is going to be considered a pretty big negative, and especially after a really nice Yorick game earlier on in the week, it's pretty disappointing to see, and Beishwan also just completely being a non-factor in this game is very disappointing. Knight was awesome in the mid lane, and that's really where we should be starting for BLG, is that this is still MVP level Knight, and he was probably better than Scout on the other side, regardless of if that shows up in the KDA, but Beishwan was giving him no attention, and that's the reason you brought Beishwan in the first place. Knight, even Elkin On, they were winning individually in their lanes, and Beishwan was just playing super safe and super passive, and that's going to be a big negative. That's something he's going to have to work out of his system. He's got to be more aggressive in terms of taking advantage of his winning lanes, even if he himself is losing, which just didn't happen here. But Elkin On, as much as they were winning in the 2v2, were not nearly as useful as Pays and missing on the other side of this in team fights, and generally, Elk has also underperformed quite a bit this year. He was the number 1 AD carry in the world for me last year. He's not been anywhere close to that in 2025. So for BLG, a little bit of a disappointing loss. Do I think it completely obliterates any hype I had for them? No, I still think this team is going to get better the more they play together. And in fact, maybe this hurdle, this speed block is going to be what they need in order to kind of take that next step, because it's just been good so far ever since Beishwan came in. But for JDG, this is a gigantic win, and specifically, it showcases what this team needs to do in order to be an elite team at the LPL level. They just need Allah and Missing to step up and be consistent, because you have pieces, you have stars elsewhere. If you can get good performances out of your role players, that's the difference between this team being average and this team being elite. But then moving on now to our 7th and final day of action here in week number 7, and as a reminder, I did commentate both of the series on the day here in day number 7, so might be a little bit of a quicker rundown. If you want a full breakdown, again, go check out the VODs. The link to the channels will be in the description for either YouTube or Twitch, whatever you prefer. But kicking off day number 7 was a worst versus first matchup between Top Esports and Thunder Talk Gaming, where Top Esports get the job done with a 2-1 series win. Credit to Thunder Talk for dominating game number 2. Kanavi completely ran it on that Talon jungle pick that he wanted to try and flex on in game 2, and they gave Seitab LeBlanc, and that's clearly his best champion, and he did completely take over on it, so credit to him for that, because I don't know if a lot of players would capitalize in the same way. But we got back to Top Esports dominance in game number 3, and they certainly dominated game number 1, so we kind of eventually got where we were supposed to get to, but definitely a little detour in game 2. Player of the series for me is going to go to Crisp in the support position. I thought he was phenomenal here today. The Alistair was really great in game number 1, a couple of great knockbacks that really influenced a lot of the game. His team fighting was pretty exceptional in that one, and then he was great on the Rel in game number 3. That Magnet Storm that really kind of ended the game, a really great follow-up engage around Otacon, like that was Crisp. He was the one who kind of created that play for the team, and so to me, he was the easiest choice for player of the series here. Jackie Love obviously did a great job of being able to express his damage, especially in game 1 on the Ezreal, where he was spectacular. There were times where he was getting close to one-shotting people, not necessarily something Ezreal should be doing at a point in the game, but Jackie Love definitely deserves credit for it. And outside of game number 2, Kanavi still was really great in this series, and game 3 was pretty back and forth. Thunder Talk was in a decent spot, and they were trying to scale the game because they have Gwen, they have Zeri, they have Lulu, they even have Akali, right? They have so much damage in the back half of the game, but Kanavi Kanavi was the one to kind of shut the door in game number 3 on the Nidalee by stealing multiple objectives. He's able to get Otacon, and he's able to get that Baron, which is ginormous for top esports. So credit to Kanavi. He did a great job at being able to stabilize, and he was great in game 1 on the Xinjiao as well. I just know a lot of people are going to pull their memory back from that Talon game in game number 2, and I don't necessarily blame them, but certainly something to keep in mind. Cream was a little bit disappointing in this one. I really don't think he had that great of a day, and I really don't think he had that great of a week, all things considered, but they certainly didn't need him in order to pick up a victory here. It's a win for top esports, and for Thunder Talk, they put up a decent fight in this series, considering they are the worst team right now in Group Ascend, but they just don't have the talent to be able to overcome the problems that they create for themselves, most notably Hoya on the top side, who is going to get dud of the series for me. This is almost entirely for the Gwen in game number 3. Not only was this a horrendous Gwen game where he got super far behind 369, he was down like 50 CS in the mid game here, but he wasn't able to do anything in team fights. And when you look at the way that Thunder Talk is constructed, yes, you want to play front to back and kind of play around the Zeri, but the Zeri can kind of do her own thing because you've got a Kali and Gwen who should be diving the backline and really upsetting the Varus and upsetting the Tristana, like the double marksman comp on the other side, and it just didn't really end up happening. The Gwen was completely out of the game, and Hoya is just not an LPL caliber top laner. Like, I've seen some people compare Hoya to Bertle, and I think it makes sense because they came out of similar systems and kind of have similar career arcs, but Hoya is not even half the player that Bertle is. Like, let's be real here. I'm a Bertle defender. I have been for quite a long time. Hoya's just a bad top laner, and he's really never proven himself to even be average. There was the half a split he spent when he joined Thunder Talk the first time, but after that, he's never even been remotely good, and I think things have just gotten worse. Credit to Satab. He was awesome on LeBlanc in game 2, got super fed on Akali in game 3, and then did absolutely jack squat on it. A horrible teleport. Ends up really costing Thunder Talk the game in game 3 on the Akali, which is never ideal. Of course, he got mega outplayed in game 1 as well. 1xN tried, but can you really even say that? Like, he was good on the Lucian. He got his Penta stolen from him in game number 2, but the Zeri was invisible in game 3, and that's one of your biggest win conditions. Feather was fine, like Xiao Huangren was fine. I'm certainly not complaining about those guys, but at least Thunder Talk put up a fight. Top Esports was just better on the day, and you're not particularly surprised by that. They're getting closer and closer to locking in that number 1 seed, and they definitely deserve it. You can give them all the credit in the world for that. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in the LPL, and it was a dominant matchup between Anyone's Legend and Team WE, where AL are going to pick up the 2-0 win. No surprise here, no shock. Everybody kind of saw this one coming, so I don't think anybody's going to be sitting there going like, oh no, you know, I can't believe it. Just AL dominating, right? I'm glad to see that at least one of our top tier teams ended up walking out of day number 7 with a dominant 2-0 victory, but we'll quickly get into this because there's really not a lot to talk about when it comes to these two teams. Shanks is going to get player of the series for me, although I think Tarzan definitely deserves to be mentioned. I just think Shanks was a tad bit more consistent in terms of how he played out the back half of this series. That Orianna game was gorgeous from him. I don't think he's going to get nearly enough credit for how well he played that one. Obviously, you can see my live thoughts, and you can see me live go like, obviously Shanks is MVP, but going back and rewatching the game, it's even more apparent just how fantastic he was in the mid lane and how big of a lead he was able to generate for his team just by playing the way that he did in game 2. He was great on the Annie in game number 1 as well. Just really good stuff from Shanks. Really like the way that he's been playing as of late. He's a player I've criticized in the past for maybe not being super consistent towards the end of the split. That's not necessarily been the case here. He's been awesome throughout the entirety of spring so far. Tarzan, of course, deserves a shout out here for just being great in the jungle, being way better than Monkey on the other side. And, I like Monkey. I think he's an interesting player for WE, probably my favorite player on that team right now, but Tarzan is Tarzan. Like, when he gets a lead, he's just going to be able to dominate games, and that's exactly what he did on both Pantheon and on Vi, but specifically on that Pantheon in game 1, where you give him a kill at level 1, he's going to run the rest of the entire series. It's pretty ridiculous. Hope and KL were pretty fine. Like, they didn't exactly set the world on fire in terms of how they played in this series, but they didn't need to. Hope's positioning is still incredibly good in these team fights, and Vampire kind of gave them a ton of free resources on his own, so you can kind of feel good about that. Flandra was really solid, completely obliterated Cube on the top side. He was the only player who even played remotely fine. Cube honestly was okay on the Cassante, but Flandra was even better in terms of the leads that he was able to generate for himself. AL was just dominant across the board. No notes, no negatives, all positives for that team. And then for WE on the other side, there were a couple of players that I think really underperformed here today, most notably the ones that people are really excited about, Monkey and Vampire. I think were both incredibly bad for WE in this series. Vampire is going to be the one to get dud of the series for me. ends up giving away first blood at level 1 in game number 1, and then ends up running it down multiple times throughout the rest of the game on the Nautilus. And even after that first blood, it was basically over at that point, and then obviously was horrible on the Leona in game number 2. I don't even think I really need to go into all of the specific plays. You can, again, go ahead and watch me react to them live, where he's just going in by himself and dying. It's really absurd. And then Monkey just did not have the Olaf jungle work in game number 1. We've seen him pull out this pick before, but it really did not work in game number 1. The Xinjiao got super out-tempoed in game number 2 as well. It just was not a very good series from the players that I would consider pretty big pivot points for WE. I think Taeyun is also a pretty big pivot point down on the bot side, but if Monkey is playing bad, if Vampire is playing bad, it's kind of doomed. The best performing player on the team here was Cube in the top lane, and that's not a good sign because he was doing it on Cassante in game number 2, a champion that, yes, he does scale relatively okay into the late game. I think he's a pretty good team fighter, but he built full tank, built no MR going up against an Orianna who had a ton of gold and just got deleted in a ton of these fights, couldn't really accomplish nearly enough in the front to back. So for WE, it just wasn't a particularly productive series, all things considered, but nobody's surprised. Again, WE was expected to lose this one, and AL was expected to dominate this one, and that's exactly what they did. It's really nice to see this team kind of retake their spot near the top of the leaderboard and definitely be considered a top 2 team once again. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL week number 7 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 7 weeks of action. We are getting closer and closer to getting basically everything locked in. Only 1 week remains, and it's kind of a shortened week. The only thing left to determine is who is going to lock in those final 2 spots out of the 3 teams fighting for it to make it into playoffs immediately without having to go through the play-in spot, without, having to go through one best of 5 to qualify. JDG, BLG, Invictus all fighting it out for 2 spots at the moment. Of course, we'll talk about that more next week, but you can see my personal power rankings, which are updated to the right of every single team. Change is going to be how that has changed from last week to this week. We can go over kind of the risers, the fallers, the changes. Not that many changes this week, but they are near the top of the standings, which is always pretty fun. Anyone's Legend is going to move back up to number 2 in my power rankings. It's pretty clear that it's a top 2 between top esports and AL right now, and AL definitely felt a lot more on track than they did in week number 6. JDG is going to move all the way back up to number 3. I feel pretty okay about this. Right now, it's like JDG, BLG, whoever you want at 3 and 4, I think is up to you, but JDG winning the series, and especially winning it so emphatically, means it's pretty easy to put them at number 3 right now. BLG is going to fall back down to number 4. I was a little bit fast, a little bit quick on the trigger to put them up to number 2 in my power rankings last week, but I honestly believed that after they beat Anyone's Legend. I still think this team absolutely can win the LPL, and if they do not be surprised, but at least for now, they've got some kinks they need to work out, so they're going to fall to 4. Invictus is going to leapfrog Weibo Gaming. Last week I said that they're basically the same team. Invictus is definitely a better version of where Weibo is at right now, but I still think that they're both incredibly inconsistent. And if Invictus loses their best of 5, they need to get into playoffs randomly against a team like EDG. Are any of us going to be all that surprised? Like, that's just kind of what they do. So IG is still only going to stay at number 5, even though they beat JD Gaming earlier this week. Weibo falls down to number 6 to compensate, and then of course the rest of the standings is basically the same. The bottom of the standings all lost the supposed series they were supposed to, lose this week. So no real shockers, no real changes there. And then obviously no group Nirvana matches left. So we're just getting closer and closer, but that's the power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down below. But let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 7. Player of the week for me was very difficult. So many good options this week. I think you could genuinely give this to like 6 or 7 different players if you really wanted to. But I landed on Shun, the jungler for JD Gaming. I honestly do think he was the best player in the LPL this week. Even in that Invictus Gaming series, I thought he was generally fine. The player that ended up beating him in his role in that series is an honorable mention for me here in Jeje, which we will get into in just a second, but Shun was incredible in the series that really mattered. He stepped up a ton against Weibo Gaming, especially on Lilia in game number 2. You can't give him Neferi like FPX did in game 1, and he was tremendous against his former club in BLG as well in that series. So for me, Shun was going to get player of the series, but my honorable mentions, again, there's like 40 players you could give this to this week. Players like Tarzan and Hope I had to exclude from this. Crisp was awesome across this entire week. I had to exclude him from this. Pays is not here after the incredible highlight-worthy week that he ended up having. It was just incredible how many great performances we had in the LPL this week, but I'm giving my honorable mentions to Jackie Love, the AD carry for Top Esports, and Jeje, the jungler for Invictus Gaming. To me, these two kind of stood out above the rest in terms of the consistency that they brought. Jackie Love, I think, would have gotten Player of the Week in most weeks with the performances he put up here. I just think Shun was a little bit better, and Jeje was awesome. It's just unfortunate that Invictus played less games than everybody else. That's really the only thing holding him back from getting Player of the Week. But my dud of the week, unfortunately, not quite as divisive as my Player of the Week is. It was pretty obvious. It's going to go to Satab, the mid laner for Thunder Talk. He just was awful across this week. Some will point to that LeBlanc game in Game 2 against anyone, or against Top Esports, as a game that could potentially, disqualify him for dud of the week. But every other game outside of that, he was just horrendous, and he actively lost almost every single series here for Thunder Talk. So for me, not a particularly difficult decision. PP God was the only other player that I really considered for dud of the week, but I landed on Satab. So Satab's dud of the week, and Shun is my Player of the Week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LPL, both the end of the regular season, the play-in best of fives, as well as the playoffs themselves, as per usual, but we cover all three of the other major regions as well on this channel, so LTA North, LEC, and LCK every single week, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all